Wait, Master Sergeant Whitfield? Is that really you? That was the sentence that changed everything. Not shouted in anger, not delivered as an accusation, just a colonel's voice, stunned and disbelieving, cutting through the polite murmur of a military ball, aimed at a quiet old man in an ill-fitting rented tuxedo who had spent the entire evening trying not to be noticed by anyone. But we'll get there. 2 weeks before that evening, I was sitting in my daughter's kitchen, listening to my son-in-law describe, at some length, his own decorated service record to a table of his friends, while I quietly cleared plates in the background like the help. I remember the exact moment one of his friends turned to me and asked, kindly enough, whether I'd ever served myself. And I remember my son-in-law answering for me before I could open my mouth. Hal? No. Hal's never been military. Different generation, different priorities, I think. And I remember my daughter sitting at that same table, not correcting him, because by then, correcting him about my service had become its own complicated thing she'd rather avoid. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really begins. My name is Harold Whitfield. Everyone who knows me now calls me Hal. I'm 69 years old. I live alone in a small house at the edge of a quiet town, the same house my wife Doreen and I bought the year I retired, from 28 years of active service, the last 12 of them as a master sergeant in a ranger battalion, doing work that still doesn't come up easily in conversation, even decades later. Doreen passed 3 years ago. She was the only person who ever fully understood both halves of me, the quiet gardener half, and the half that used to disappear for months at a time to places I couldn't name, and came home changed in ways I never fully explained even to her. I have a dog, an old beagle named Scout, who follows me around the house the way dogs do when they've decided you're the only reliable thing left in their world. Some mornings, the quiet of that house is the only company I keep until Scout demands his walk. Here's the thing about me that my daughter Sarah grew up mostly not understanding, even though the evidence of it sat quietly in a footlocker in the garage her entire life. 28 years, 2 combat tours, a chest full of ribbons I never wore anywhere except my own retirement ceremony, and a specific afternoon in a valley whose name I still don't say out loud easily. An afternoon that earned me a Bronze Star with Valor device I've never once described in detail to anyone who wasn't there with me. When I retired and Sarah was still young, Doreen and I made a decision. We didn't want our daughter growing up measuring her father against medals and deployments, treating me like some kind of legend instead of just her dad. We wanted her to know me as the man who coached her softball team, who sat through every recital in a folding chair too small for him, who cried without shame at her college graduation. So the uniform went into a footlocker in the garage, and we simply didn't discuss that part of my life very often at home. Not from shame, from a wish that Sarah's understanding of her father be built on the ordinary, daily proof of love, rather than on old ribbons she'd never fully understand the weight of. Sarah grew up. She went to college, became a nurse, and in her late 20s, she met a man named Connor Reyes, an active-duty Army officer, a captain at the time, who took enormous, visible pride in his own service, a pride that, I came to understand fairly quickly, left very little room in his mind for the idea that a quiet, retired man doing yard work in cargo shorts might have a service record of his own worth mentioning. From the very first dinner I had with Sarah and Connor, I noticed the particular way he spoke about his own deployments, proudly, at length, in the specific tone of a man who has decided that military service is the most interesting thing about anyone, including himself, and who has never once considered that the people around him might be carrying stories he hadn't bothered to ask about. "So Hal," he asked that first evening, cutting into his steak with the easy confidence of a man used to commanding a room, "Sarah says you worked in logistics or something, before you retired?" "Something like that," I said, because it wasn't the moment, at a first dinner, to correct a young officer's assumption about an old man he'd already decided was harmless. "Good honest work," he said, in the tone of a man being generous about something he'd already privately dismissed. "Not everyone's cut out for the sharp end of things. No shame in that." I let it go. "That's what you do, the first time. You let it go because you don't want to be the father who starts an argument with his daughter's new boyfriend over dinner table assumptions. But dinner number one became years of dinners, and every one of them I watched Connor's confident, well-meaning dismissal of my supposed civilian background calcify into something Sarah simply stopped correcting, because correcting it, at a certain point, would have meant explaining why she'd let the misunderstanding stand for so long in the first place. At their wedding, during his best man's toast, a fellow officer joked warmly about how Connor was marrying into a nice, quiet family, no competition in the war stories department, and the whole reception laughed, Sarah included, glancing at me quickly to see if I minded. I smiled and raised my glass. Because that's what you do at your daughter's wedding. You let small inaccuracies pass so the day stays hers. At a 4th of July barbecue 2 years ago, Connor told a group of his active duty friends, gesturing toward me across the yard, "That's my father-in-law Hal. Sweet guy, never served, but he makes a mean burger, so we keep him around." His friends laughed. I flipped burgers and let it pass, because correcting a joke at a barbecue felt like more trouble than it was worth. There was an evening, about a year ago, when I stopped by Sarah and Connor's house to drop off a ladder Connor had borrowed, and I overheard him through the screen door before I knocked, talking to a fellow officer on the phone. No, my father-in-law's harmless, retired civilian guy, worked logistics or supply or something. Never saw any real action. You know the type. I stood on that step holding nothing but my own quiet for a good 10 seconds, listening to my son-in-law describe 28 years of my life, including an afternoon that still visits me some nights, as something small and unremarkable. And then I knocked, handed him nothing since I'd already dropped the ladder earlier, and asked how his training rotation was going. He never knew I'd heard a word. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't angry at Sarah in the way people are angry at strangers. Sarah loved her husband, and Connor wasn't cruel. He'd simply built an entire understanding of his father-in-law on an assumption he'd made at a single dinner years earlier and never once bothered to verify, because verifying it would have required a conversation neither of us had gone looking for. What none of us fully appreciated, until the night of that formal military ball, was that Connor's current battalion commander, a full colonel named Everett Briggs, had served as a young captain himself, decades earlier, in the very same Ranger battalion I'd spent 12 years in, and had, in fact, been a young lieutenant present during the Pacific Valley operation that earned me my Bronze Star, an operation whose details had been passed down through that unit's institutional memory as something close to legend among the men who'd served there since. I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew, 3 weeks before the ball, was that Connor had been invited to a formal dining-in event honoring his battalion's incoming and outgoing leadership, and that spouses and, in this case, one particular father-in-law, had been invited along as a courtesy, mostly, I suspected, so Connor could show off a functional, presentable family unit to his superiors. "You don't have to come, Hal, if it's not your kind of thing," Connor said, in the tone of a man extending an obligation rather than an invitation. "It's pretty formal. Lots of military tradition, toasts, that sort of ceremony. Might be a long night for you." "I'll manage," I said, and rented a tuxedo that didn't quite fit right, because I hadn't worn formal wear since Doreen's funeral and hadn't thought to update the measurements. The evening began exactly as Connor had implied it would. Formal, ceremonial, full of toasts and traditions I understood better than he realized. Standing quietly near the back of the room in my ill-fitting tuxedo, content to be forgettable furniture at my son-in-law's professional event. I want to describe what happened next exactly as it occurred, because it's the moment everything changed, and it happened without me saying a single word to start it. Colonel Everett Briggs, making his rounds through the reception before the formal dinner began, greeting various officers and their families with the practiced warmth of a man who'd done this 1,000 times, stopped mid-sentence when his eyes landed on me across the room. I watched his face shift from polite social autopilot to something else entirely, a kind of stunned, searching recognition, the look of a man trying to confirm something his memory was insisting couldn't possibly be standing in front of him at a hotel ballroom decades later. "Wait," he said, loud enough that conversation nearby quieted on its own, crossing the room directly toward me with a purposefulness that made Connor, standing nearby, turn to see what had captured his commander's attention so completely. "Master Sergeant Whitfield, is that really you?" "It's been a long time, Colonel," I said, and I want to note that I said it quietly, without any performance in it at all, the same tone I might have used to mention the weather. "A long time," Briggs repeated, shaking his head slowly, extending his hand with an urgency that made several nearby officers turn to watch. "I was a second lieutenant, 22 years old, scared out of my mind, and you were the reason half my platoon walked out of that valley instead of getting carried out. I've told that story to junior officers for 20 years, and I never once thought I'd see you again, let alone standing at my own dining-in." Connor's face, I noticed, had gone through several rapid transformations: confusion, then something like dawning alarm, then a kind of careful blankness as he tried to process what his commanding officer was implying about the man he'd spent years describing as harmless and civilian. "Sir," Connor said carefully, "I think there might be some confusion. Hal's my father-in-law. He didn't serve, logistics background, I believe, before he retired." Colonel Briggs looked at Connor with an expression that made the younger man visibly straighten. "Captain Reyes, this man is a retired master sergeant with a bronze star with Valor device, a Purple Heart, and, if my memory serves correctly, roughly 28 years of active service, including deployments most of the men in this room would need considerable clearance just to hear the details of. I don't know what you've been told, but logistics background is not remotely accurate." Sarah, standing beside Connor, had gone very still, watching a room full of her husband's colleagues absorb information about her own father that she herself had never fully insisted on making clear to anyone, including, I suspected, herself. "Dad," she said very quietly, "why didn't you ever say something? I want to tell you honestly what happened in me in that moment, because I think it matters." Something that had been quiet and folded away for decades opened its eyes, not with anger, but with a kind of tired, patient clarity, the specific stillness of a man who has spent years deciding, deliberately, that some stories are better carried quietly than performed loudly at dinner parties. "Because it wasn't my place to correct your husband's assumptions about a father-in-law he'd already decided was harmless," I said, quiet enough that only she, Connor, and the colonel could hear clearly. "And because that valley isn't a story I've ever enjoyed telling at social functions, Sarah. It cost men their lives. It's not a party trick I keep in my back pocket for moments like this." Colonel Briggs, to his credit, seemed to understand immediately the delicate territory he'd stumbled into. "Captain Reyes," he said to Connor, his voice gentler now, "I'd suggest you spend some time this evening actually asking your father-in-law real questions, instead of the assumptions you've apparently been operating on. Some of the finest soldiers I've ever served with were exactly this quiet about it." The formal dinner proceeded around us with a different kind of attention following our table for the rest of the evening. Not admiration exactly, but a recalibrated respect that Connor, in particular, seemed to find almost as uncomfortable as his previous years of polite dismissal had apparently been comfortable. Connor drove us home that night instead of letting Sarah take the wheel, and the car was quiet for a long while before anyone spoke. "I've spent years telling people you never served," he said finally, his voice low. "I made jokes about it. At our own wedding. I feel like an idiot." "You made an assumption at a single dinner years ago and never revisited it," I said. "That's not idiocy. That's just what happens when nobody bothers to ask the real question, and the person who could answer it doesn't feel like volunteering it unprompted." "Why didn't you ever correct me?" he asked. "Any of the times I said it?" "Because correcting a confident young officer about his father-in-law's service record at his own dinner table felt like more trouble than it was worth," I said. "And if I'm honest, some part of me didn't mind being underestimated. It's restful, being the harmless old man nobody expects anything from. I got used to the quiet of it." "The colonel said you saved half his platoon," Sarah said from the passenger seat, her voice careful. "What actually happened out there?" The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where the ballroom is the climax and everything after is a footnote. But that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Sarah asking, over several dinners, careful, genuine questions about my service. Questions that required sitting with answers that didn't resolve neatly into simple, comfortable stories. It's Connor requesting, awkwardly at first, that I speak with some of his junior soldiers about leadership under pressure. An invitation extended with considerably more humility than his previous years of dismissal had shown. There was an afternoon, about a month after the dining-in, when Sarah asked if she could see my old service file, the citations, the actual details I'd never shared with her. I told her some of it, enough for her to understand the shape of that valley without carrying every detail of it the way I had for decades. She cried, quietly, not out of drama but out of a kind of delayed grief, for a version of her father's history she'd never made room to properly know. "Why didn't Mom ever push you to tell me more?" she asked. "Because your mother understood something. It took me longer to understand myself," I said. "That some things are mine to tell when I'm ready, not simply because someone else decides it's time." She respected that, even when I think it frustrated her sometimes. Connor, for his part, came to me a few weeks later, sitting with me in the garage where the old footlocker still lived, asking careful questions about the valley, about the men I'd lost, about what leadership actually looked like when the confident version of it stopped being useful. "I spent years assuming the loudest story in the room was the most important one," he said. "I never considered the quiet ones might be carrying something heavier than anything I've done." "Most people don't," I said. "That's not an insult to you specifically. It's just how attention works. Loud stories get told, quiet ones get carried." I watched my daughter, in those weeks, do something I hadn't fully seen her do before. I watched her stop letting other people's assumptions about her own family stand uncorrected. At a family gathering not long after, when a cousin asked, innocently, whether I'd ever done anything exciting before retiring, Sarah answered before I could, for the first time in years, correctly. "My father served 28 years, including combat tours most people can't fully imagine, and received a Bronze Star for saving half a platoon in an ambush. I spent most of my life not fully understanding that, because I let assumptions stand instead of asking real questions. I'm done doing that." I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after finally setting down a story you'd carried quietly, mostly alone, for decades. I thought about Doreen a great deal in those weeks. What she would have said, watching our daughter finally ask the hard questions neither of us had pushed her toward, watching Connor learn, slowly, to ask real questions instead of confident assumptions. I think Doreen would have been proudest, not of the ballroom moment, but of the quiet conversations in the garage that followed it. It's been almost a year now. Sarah and Connor live about 20 minutes from me, and Sarah comes by most weekends now, sometimes with Connor, sometimes alone, and we sit on the back porch with Scout underfoot, and don't always talk about anything important, which is its own kind of gift after a year like that one. Colonel Briggs and I exchange letters occasionally now, an old habit neither of us expected to revive after all these years. He asked me, a few months ago, whether I'd consider speaking at a formal event honoring veterans of that Valley operation, an invitation I accepted carefully, on my own terms, sharing only as much as felt right to share publicly. Last month, Sarah was helping me clean out the garage and asked, unprompted, if she could go through the old footlocker properly, not out of urgent curiosity, but out of genuine interest in knowing her father more completely. She sat on an overturned bucket with the old uniform in her lap for a long time. "Why'd you keep all of this hidden for so long?" she asked. "Not just from Connor, from me." "Because I didn't want you to know your father as a soldier first," I said. "I wanted you to know him as a father. I still do. The soldier survived something terrible. The father was for making sure you never had to carry the weight of that valley alongside me." She looked at the old uniform a long moment, then up at me. "You could have been both the whole time," she said. "I just never asked the right questions, and I let Connor's assumptions become my own, because it was easier than pushing back on something I didn't fully understand myself." I think about that often now. How much of the people we love we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding on purpose, but because we've already decided, quietly and long ago, what shape we expect them to take. Connor looked at me for years and saw an unremarkable, harmless old man with nothing significant behind him. He wasn't entirely wrong that I preferred an unremarkable life. He was wrong about nearly everything else. Some evenings now, I sit on the back porch with Scout and think about how strange the shape of a life turns out to be. I spent 28 years being a man very few people fully understood. Not because I hid it out of shame, but because I never once thought it needed announcing. And because some of what I carried was never mine alone to perform for an audience. Doreen used to say I held that valley the way some men hold grief, quietly, respectfully, without needing anyone else's validation of its weight. I think she understood the shape of that quiet better than I ever articulated it myself. I don't regret the years of keeping that footlocker closed. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I let the misunderstanding go on as long as I did. I'd do it again. Every quiet dinner where I let Connor's assumptions stand uncorrected. Every year Sarah grew up thinking of me as simply her father rather than a decorated soldier. I would trade all of it again for a daughter who loved me first for showing up to her softball games, and only later, on her own timeline, for whatever those ribbons represented. That's what a father owes his daughter, the way I see it. Not a legacy to perform, a love that doesn't require an audience. What I do regret, if I'm honest, is not finding a gentler way to correct the record myself, before a colonel's recognition forced the timing in front of an entire ballroom. I thought silence was a form of protection, and in many ways it was. But I've learned, watching my daughter finally ask the hard questions and correct the record herself at a family gathering, that some truths deserve a quieter, more deliberate unveiling than the one circumstance handed us that night. Connor mistook my quiet history for an unremarkable one, because I let him. Sarah made the same mistake for longer than either of us are entirely comfortable admitting. I don't blame either of them for it. I built that impression myself, year by careful year, for reasons that made sense to me at the time. But I'm glad, in the end, that the truth finally had its say, however accidentally it arrived. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all this, it's this. The quietest person at your table may be carrying something far heavier than you've ever imagined, and the plainest history is not always the whole story. Don't mistake someone's humility for having nothing significant behind it. And don't wait for a stranger to recognize the weight someone's been carrying before you finally ask them the real questions yourself. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone in your life who's underestimated the quiet ones. Somebody out there needs to hear it today.